This event is, as you might also know, is organized by Directorate General Taxation and Customs Union, TAXUD, of the European Commission. My name is Camilla, and I have been a part of the CBAM team since the proposal. For today, I will be the moderator. My colleagues, Maxime and Thomas, will guide you through this webinar. We would like to thank you for being here. This is the first webinar out of 6 sector-specific webinars. These webinars will introduce the rules and the requirements for the transitional period for importers, customs representatives, exporters, operators, and producers of cement of the EU and of third countries. 5 other webinars are dedicated for the aluminium, fertilizers, electricity, hydrogen, and iron and steel. One final webinar will be provided for the competent authorities of the EU member states. First, we would like to inform you about your registration in Zoom. Please make sure that your name will appear, including your affiliation. If needed, please rename yourself by using the following steps as shown on the screen. This is useful to us when we will address the questions raised in the chat by you during this webinar. As I've said in the beginning, many participants has now joined this webinar. So I would like to inform you about the housekeeping rules during this webinar. All participants need to be muted during the presentation. And please note that the webinar is recorded and that you are not allowed to record yourself. You may at any time write the questions in the chat that you may have. The chat is available for all participants and will be answered at the end of the presentations in today's webinar. For this webinar, we invite you to focus on the questions for the cement sector and the transitional period, not on the other aspects of the CBAM. And last, please note that this webinar cannot be used for the definitive views expressed by the European Commission or can be looked at as legally binding. Hopefully you have now a pool on Zoom, and we would like to invite you to tell us where you're coming from and which entity you represent. Scrolling through the results, we are happy to see that many participants from all over the world has joined this webinar. It is the aim of the webinar to reach out to as many different actors in CBAM as possible. So now I'd like to navigate you through the agenda for today. Okay, I would like to navigate you just briefly through what is to expect of today. For this webinar, we would present the requirements and rule for the transitional period. We would look at the specific case for cement, and we will also briefly look into the CBAM transitional registry and the timeline for submitting the CBAM reports. And now let's move on to the fun part. It is my pleasure to welcome our Director for Indirect Taxation and Tax Administration at DG TAXUD. Let me introduce to you our Director, Maria Elena Scobbio. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and welcome to all. I am sure that everyone will forgive you the few technical issues you're having, because this is a major effort that we are all doing to try to bring to those who will need to operate with CBAM the right information and opening up a channel of communication that is unprecedented, I would say, in the Commission. So I would like to welcome everyone today and to see that there is a huge participation, in particular from new importers and exporters established in third countries, which are the ones that will be targeted the most by our new discipline. I would just like to say a few words to introduce this very first webinar. We are kicking off this series of webinar with this one, which is on cement. So we will continue with the other sectors, but this doesn't stop here. We will always have a way to communicate and dialogue with operators. This is the reason why the transitionary period is here, to try to learn as much as possible on this system from both sides. So just to have a few words on what is the framework in which we are here operating. We consider CBAM as a cornerstone of the climate measures that the EU is currently implementing. Just to make a bit of history, it was first announced in 2019 as part of the European Green Deal. And then it became a huge part of the Fit for 55 package that was proposed in July 2021. This is a key feature of this package because it will support the ambition of achieving net reduction of greenhouse gas by 55% in 2030 and aiming at full neutrality by 2050. Now, we should just look at what's happening recently all around the world and what we know the best here in Europe, but we are not alone. Unprecedented climate and environmental crisis. We need to have immediate action if we have to stop this happening or slow down the climate change that is bringing us to this. We need to preserve a livable planet for the future generations. So we need to address what we call the triple planetary crisis, which is composed of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. We cannot wait. We need to act. We have set them, these are very ambitious targets in the Paris agreements, and we all need to step up efforts internationally and through national policies. The question is not if, now the question is when and how. So we need to develop environmental and climate policy actions in a way that achieve all our international commitments, but also that minimize the impact on trade. That's why we tried to devise a system that tries to have at heart both of these features. The CBAM tries to put a fair price on the carbon emitted during the production of carbon-intensive goods that are entering in the EU in a way that we see would encourage cleaner industrial production, not only inside the EU, but also in non-EU countries. We need to do this with transparency. This is not a protectionist measure. We are all together in this. So we need to work together. And this is a part of the intensive dialogue that we have started and will continue to have with stakeholders, with partner countries, with all kind of counterparts that we will have in this process. We are working extensively with all our international partners. We want to ensure a smooth implementation of the mechanism. We want to find the synergies wherever it's possible. We want to promote effective methods of decarbonization. We would love to have a system that works for all. We have tried to do this for the last 4 years, but we will keep working with our global efforts because what we need is try to do together this green transition. And those that are considered the least developed countries and that are the most in difficulty will not be left behind. I just want to remind you that the EU is one of the biggest contributors for climate financing. And in fact, the best CBAM would be a CBAM that no longer exists, a CBAM where that is not needed anymore. To this end, as I said, we engage with all the stakeholders. We have spoken to public authorities, businesses, federations, media, NGOs, name it. And the communication campaign that has accompanied all the latest steps is a testimony to this. We would like to help all of you prepare for this new phase with written guidance, online trainings, which include like the webinar we are having today, but you're also going to have e-learning courses. Everything will be made available in our dedicated webpage. For instance, this webinar will be recorded and it will be at the disposal of all the ones that were not able to participate, because unfortunately we needed to have a limit to the capacity of our live participation today. We will keep update regularly this page, so you can just check on it regularly to see how we are introducing new communication instruments, and all this data will be translated in the most spoken languages in the world. I am really happy to see that we are so many, and the interest around this was really very big. We don't want to exclude anyone, as I said, so we will keep trying to reach as much as possible everyone who is interested by CBAM. Your participation today shows the worldwide interest that exists around CBAM. And I'm really happy that we are trying to meet this interest, and we will keep striving to do so. Without no further ado, I would just like to now leave you in the hands of my extremely capable colleagues, and they will run you through this webinar. So happy continuation, and thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you very much, Elena. It's a great reminder, and thank you for the kind words to the team. Now, I'm happy to give the floor to Maxime. Maxime will present us with the general aspects of CBAM, and now it's the interesting part that's about to start. Maxime, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Camilla, and thank you, Thomas. The CBAM aims at preventing the carbon leakage while free allowances are phased out of under the EU emission trading scheme, which is the EU's pricing scheme. The carbon leakage risk occurs when companies based in the EU move their carbon-intensive production abroad to countries where less stringent climate policies are in place than the EU, or when EU products are replaced by more carbon-intensive imports. And this is how the CBAM complements the EU ETS. It puts a carbon price on imports of certain goods that are produced in non-EU countries and imported into the EU. And this carbon price will be calculated so as it is equivalent to the one that would have been paid if the producer of this good had been located in the EU, hence subject to the EU carbon pricing scheme. Another objective of the CBAM is to encourage non-EU countries and their producers to decarbonize their production processes. And by doing so, the CBAM charge that will be applied on goods that they export to the EU will be lowered. Next slide. As you can see on this slide, now we are looking at the reporting obligation during the transitional phase. Maybe as a few words of introduction on the CBAM, just to let you know that it was adopted by the EU and officially entered into force in May this year, 2023. And the CBAM regulation, implementing regulation of 17th of August, will start applying as from 1st of October this year, in a couple of weeks, with the transitional period. All the webinar sessions, including that of today, will focus on the transitional phase. Therefore, during the presentation, we will touch upon the definitive period here and there where it is relevant, but we will not discuss the specific rules applying to the definitive phase of CBAM as such during the webinars, and we thank you for your understanding. Now, the transitional phase. It is a 2-year period during which the CBAM will focus on monitoring and reporting. Monitoring because it is a learning phase for all of us, during which we will collect relevant information on carbon content of goods covered by a CBAM and imported into the EU. And this monitoring phase has a twofold objective. First, ensuring a seamless rollout of the CBAM as from October 2023, And second objective, helping us prepare best to ensure a smooth kicking of the definitive period as from 1st of January 2026. To this end, until 2025, the CBAM will focus on reporting. This means that importers will only have reporting obligations to comply with. They will have to report on carbon emissions of the goods that they import into the EU and that are covered by the CBAM. Importers will have to submit their CBAM reports for each quarter. The CBAM reports will essentially contain the information, as you can see appearing on the screen, which is the total quantity of each type of goods expressed in megawatt hours for electricity and in tons for other goods, for each installation producing the good. The actual total embedded emissions of each type of good expressed in tons of CO2 emissions per megawatt hour for electricity or for the goods in tons of CO2. The total indirect emissions as well. And finally, the carbon price due in the country of origin, which means the country where the goods are produced, for the embedded emissions in the good imported into the EU. And that price will take into account the relevant rebates or the forms of compensation. Thomas later will give some more explanations and details on this. One important thing to note is that there will be no financial charge applied on imported goods, no obligation to have carbon emissions verified by an accredited verifier. These are two fundamental obligations under the CBAM, the buying and surrendering of CBAM certificates and the verification. But these two fundamental designs of the CBAM will only be applicable during the definitive period, meaning as from January 2026, not during the transitional period, which will end in December 2025. However, please note that penalties may be imposed on importers by EU member states' national competent authorities for failure to comply with the reporting obligations. For instance, where reporting declarants have not taken any steps to submit the CBAM report. Also note that higher penalties may be applied where infringements are repeated. On a side note, for your information, the financial adjustment under the CBAM will enter into application with the gradual phase-in over 9 years, from 2026 to 2034, when the CBAM will be implemented fully comprehensively. And this gradual phase-in will mirror the gradual phase-out of free allowances in the EU ETS for EU producers in the same sectors as those covered by the CBAM for producers in third countries. Now let's move to the CBAM emissions and the reporting of those emissions in the transitional phase. This slide is about the following question. What emissions are in scope of the CBAM? As a start, let's say that there are 3 categories of emissions, from 1 to 3, and this mirrors the ETS. CBAM focuses on direct emissions, and these are emissions generated from the production of goods at the installation level. Direct emissions include emissions from the production of heating and cooling as well, even if that production takes place outside the installation. Then we have scope 2 emissions, and these scope 2 emissions means the consumption of electricity during the production of the goods in scope of CBAM. During the transitional period, indirect scope 2 emissions have to be reported for all goods in scope of CBAM. In the definitive period, which means as from 2026, there will be some differentiations depending on the sectors, and notably for the iron and steel and aluminum sectors. Finally, we are also counting in scope 3 emissions, upstreams, which are upstream emissions from CBAM goods that are used as inputs into other CBAM goods that we call complex goods. And Thomas will give further explanations on this. These materials are called precursors. Finally, we have the scope 3 emissions, which also mean downstream emissions, such as the consumption, the transportation, and distribution. You can see then they are the emissions in blue on the screen, and these emissions are not in the CBAM scope.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Maxime. Now let's move to the second part of the webinar, which will focus on the specifications for cement. Thomas, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Camilla, and welcome to this seminar also from my side. So this section will basically describe the methodology to be used to determine embedded emissions for CBAM goods. And to do so, it's important to have a clear understanding of a few key terms that are used in the CBAM environment. Maxime already mentioned the distinction between simple and complex goods. So under CBAM, that has a very specific meaning. Simple goods are basically goods that are produced from materials, from fuels, which themselves are not CBAM goods, and they therefore are considered to have zero embedded emissions. On the other hand, complex goods are goods that rely on some materials that are themselves CBAM goods. And these CBAM goods are like input materials, and they could be either simple or they could be also other complex goods. So in the cement sector, an example is the clinker is generally considered simple good, while the cement as a product is a complex good. The other three terms I would like to introduce here refer to the production process and the setting of the system boundaries at the installation level. The production process under CBAM means basically the parts of an installation where the CBAM goods are produced and all the different process steps that are related to this production. So you have an installation that also does. The production route is then the very specific technology that is used in a certain production process. Typical example is hydrogen that is usually produced with steam methane reforming using natural gas or fossil fuel input. But more and more hydrogen is now also produced through water electrolysis. So this is a very different technology, and that is captured by the term production route. And finally, the CBAM regulation covers quite a number of goods, and they are identified with their CN codes, so from the combined nomenclature. And for the implementation of CBAM, to make things easier, these CN codes have been grouped. Goods with similar characteristics are put under the same aggregated goods category. And for each of those good category, then the implementing regulation provides information on what are the relevant system boundaries, which streams to monitor, and also what are the important precursors that need to be taken into account when calculated the embedded emissions. So concretely speaking, if you have a CBAM good and you would like to know, well, how do I have to determine? Well, you go to the implementing regulation, you find out what is the aggregated goods category, and then you find information under the aggregated goods category, what is important to monitor and what are the relevant precursors. So this is the table, an extract from the table of the Annex 1 to the CBAM regulation, which shows you the goods that are in the scope of CBAM for the cement sector. It's a rather limited list compared to the other sectors that we have. And you see that some of these goods, one good with one CN code is already a category, but then there are also some goods, in the case here of cement, where you have three different CN codes and they all fall under the same aggregated goods category. For the cement sector, only emissions of carbon dioxide are relevant. When determining the embedded emissions of a CBAM good, so that's the value that needs to be reported, there's a scheme and 5 different process steps to be followed. This slide is supposed to give you an overview, and in the following slides, I will try to explain the ideas and concept of each of these 5 steps. So it starts with splitting the installation into production processes, and that is very much helped by the aggregated goods categories that I've explained before. Then once the installation has been split, for each of those production processes, there's a need to identify the relevant parameters that need to be measured, to set up the methods, how to measure them, and then do the actual measurements. In step 3, the different emissions calculated are then attributed to the different production processes. And then in step 4 and 5, the calculation is finished by basically converting the determined emissions to specific emissions. And for that step, when in the case of a complex good, one also needs to take into account any specific embedded emissions of relevant precursors. So let's go to step 1. And on the screen here, you see a typical layout of a cement plant. And this scheme can also be found in our guidance, so you can have another look in detail, and because we cannot cover all at this seminar. So there is this cement plant first produces clinker and then basically takes the clinker and mixes it with gypsum, and then that gives the final cement product. So on the left side on the slide, you have all the different input materials. It's the input materials as such, the raw materials, it's the fuels, but also electricity that is needed for the process. And then this installation is split in 2 different production processes. First, the system boundaries are set for the clinker production, so everything related to the clinker production, and the production process 2 is then the cement production, which uses the clinker as an input material, as a precursor. And the inputs are basically what goes in, and what the output is the products and the CO2 as an emission. And this split of the installation into 2 production processes is what you would have to do in the case that the installation does not use all the clinker itself, but sells a part of the clinker maybe to another installation. If, on the contrary, the installation produces clinker and uses it all by itself to produce cement, well, then there is a possibility to simplify the determination of the embedded emissions, and that's what we call the bubble approach. So basically, you would then consider the whole cement installation as one production process, and you would look at inputs and outputs for the whole installation. So after setting the system boundaries, as I said, the monitoring needs to be defined, which parameters to monitor, which methods to use, and then carried actual monitoring out. And here are basically we have 3 groups here. It's covering direct emissions, it's covering indirect emissions, and precursors. And direct emissions have a number of different elements. The most important one and the most relevant for cement production is the direct emissions that result from the consumption of the fuels and from the materials. And on the next slide, I will go a bit more in detail into the different methodologies to look at them. So that's the installations that happen directly at the installations. The next point is direct emissions related to heat flows. So in the case that there's a cement plant that buys heat from another installation, usually it's in the form of steam and uses that as an energy, well, then the corresponding emissions have to be considered in the calculation, because the emissions probably physically happen somewhere else in another installation, but it's the cement plant that benefits from it. So to do it correctly, it's the consumption of gases that are consumed in the process, because these embedded emissions need to be added at the step 4. Most relevant emissions direct at the installation. We have 2 different types of methodologies. One is called calculation-based methodology, and the second one is the measurement-based methodology. Let's start with the measurement-based methodology. This is basically direct emissions of greenhouse gas, direct measurements of greenhouse gas emissions. So you put a sensor in the stack. The carbon dioxide emission is measured. You also need to measure the flow, and then you calculate. You can calculate the emissions of CO2 in tons. So that's a real measurement. The other two possibilities are called calculation-based methodologies. Calculation-based doesn't mean that no measurements are needed. Indeed, there are a lot of measurements that are needed, but then the emissions are, it's not that the carbon dioxide is measured directly, but the emissions are determined then indirectly from other parameters that are measured. The most widely used method in the cement sector is the standard method. So how does it work? In principle, one looks at different input streams. For example, a fuel that is used, it could be coal. One determines how much of the coal is consumed. Then that consumption is multiplied with an emission factor, CO2 per ton of coal used. And then that gives a relevant, that gives the CO2 emission. And then one has different input materials, and one does the same approach for each of the input materials, and in the end sums up the different contributions to the emissions. And the other possibility for calculation-based methodology is to use a mass balance. There one would look basically sum up all the inputs of carbon that go into the installations and look at all the outputs that leave the installation, the carbon that could go out with the materials. And by making a difference, one knows the greenhouse gas emissions that have occurred. This is typically relevant where you have a significant amount of carbon that remains in the products, for example, in steel. It's a bit more complicated. That's why in the cement sector, it's usually the standard method is used. There are other methods, and we are well aware of those. And for the transitional period, there are a number of flexibilities that have been incorporated into the rules. There are time-limited possibilities to use other methods, and there are methods, derogations, alternative methods that can be used throughout the whole transitional period. Starting with the time-limited derogations. First, until the end of 2024, it's possible to use other methods, provided that they have a similar coverage and accuracy. And we're particularly thinking there of methods that are used under other carbon pricing schemes, if they are already in place at the country of origin of the goods. It could also be a compulsory emission monitoring scheme, maybe at the country of origin of the goods. There is national legislation that requires installations to report their greenhouse gas emissions. And the third possibility, it's a scheme that has been set up at the installation already, for example, in the frame of an environmental management system. An even wider derogation or flexibility is possible until 31st of July. That means any other referenced methods could be used, and this includes also the default values that we will publish soon on our website. But this possibility is only granted until middle of next year. And finally, it's during the whole transitional period, it's possible to estimate up to 20% of the total embedded emissions. And this is particularly relevant for when an installation does some processing in a sequence of steps, but actually at that installation, only limited amount of greenhouse gas emissions occur. So if it's less than 20%, then that installation may estimate its contribution to the overall. Next slide, please. Let's come to step 3. It's the attribution of direct emissions, and that is probably the most complicated step, although in the cement sector, there are many elements here that are likely not relevant. And in most cases, they will not be relevant. So what are the directly attributed emissions of a production process? It is when you use the standard methodology, the direct emissions that happen at the installation. So from the fuels that are combusted and from the materials that are processed. Then there are 2 terms here related to this issue of the steam, import or export. So if you buy heat from another installation, you have to add the corresponding emissions. If you sell heat to another installation, well, then the corresponding emissions can be deducted. The same basically adjustment is also taking for the place for the waste gases. And if the installation combusts fuels and then produces some electricity, there's also this correction for the emissions that are then subtracted. So in the cement factor, in principle, in most cases, only the first element here, this direct emissions linked to source streams, are relevant. For the attribution of indirect emissions, the determination is much simpler. It's basically once the amount of electricity has been consumed for the production of the CBAM goods has been determined, that value just needs to be multiplied with the emission factor. And well, where does that emission factor come from? In general, it's default values that should be used. There are 2 different types. The first one is the average emission factor of the country of origin, and these data are based on data on the International Energy Agency. And for the purposes of reporting, this is also the easiest way to fulfill the reporting obligations, because these data will be made available in the transitional CBAM registry automatically. So once the electricity consumed is reported, then the IT system will take care of the rest. If there are, if other emission factors are used, well, it's possible, and then they should be based on publicly available data. There's also a possibility to use actual emission factors, but that's subject to conditions. So, and that's only possible if there is a direct technical connection between the installation that produces the electricity and the one that consumes it, or in the case of a power purchase agreement. Let's move to the 2 last steps, 4 and 5. So it's the calculation then of the final result, the specific embedded emissions. In the case of a simple good, step 4 is of course not needed. So one can go directly to the step 5. And then the specific embedded emissions is a pretty straightforward calculation. One just needs to take all the attributed emissions and divide them by the amount of goods produced. And these attributed emissions could either be the direct, this was the longer formula, or the indirect attributed emissions. So one would then get as a result the specific embedded emissions for direct or for indirect emissions. If the installation uses precursors, so in the case of complex goods, the equation needs to take into account these precursors. And if you compare the two formulas, you see that the first part, left part until the middle, is basically the same as before. But then what needs to be added is the contribution of the precursors. And it's basically if one has the specific embedded emissions of the precursor, it could be clinker if you produce cement, then you just need that number, and you need to the other is the consumption of the precursor. So how much of the precursor is used to produce the final cement product. Okay, so to illustrate a bit this the whole process, the 5 steps, I would like to show you an example, and we go back to the slide that you've already seen, where there is a cement installation, and the scope, I mean, the production processes have been split. So we have 2 production processes. One is the clinker, and then the clinker goes to the cement. Cement production is the second one. And as I said, on the left side, we have the inputs, and we have the CO2 that goes out of the production process. We have only direct emissions for the clinker production. When we go to the cement, there is no more direct emissions. There is no furnace in this case. There's just electricity consumption, and electricity is the other input material. So the relevant input materials here are marked in red. So how does now this standard methodology work for calculating direct emissions? So this is a table with numbers. I'll try to explain that. On the previous slide, we have seen the different input materials there in the first column. So we have the raw meal, we have the coal, the waste, and the heavy fuel oil. So, and the emissions direct from this clinker production are split. Basically, there are 2 different types. There's the process emissions that come from the material. The raw meal contains the limestone. The limestone is decarbonated, and that results in process emissions. So the data that is needed is the activity data. This is the AD. So how much of this raw meal goes into the process? So it's something more than 1 million tons. Then one needs the emission factor. So to know from experience or maybe from previous measurements how much CO2 is emitted per ton of raw meal. In this case, here is a standard factor. If the installation doesn't have own data, that's the value to be used. If the installation has its own data, it's even better because that will give a more precise figure. Multiplying the 2 gives the emissions. For the combustion emissions, it's the same. We need to determine how much of the fuel goes into the process. So in this case, how much coal, how much waste, how much of this heavy fuel oil, and that is multiplied with an emission factor. In this case, the emission factor is expressed per energy content. So then in that case, you also need to multiply it with a calorific value. So multiplying these 3 numbers gives you again the emission figures. So it's 209,000 for the coal, 35,000 for the waste, and 134,000 for the heavy fuel oil. Specific case here is the waste, because that contains some biomass, and biomass emissions do not count, so they have to be subtracted, provided that the biomass fulfills the sustainability criteria. In this case, the assumption is 15% of the overall waste is biomass, so only a part of the total emissions, actually 85% then, is taken as fossil emissions. So then all the 4 contributions from the raw meal and from the 3 different fuels are summed up, and that gives the direct emissions. So the total direct emissions are taken over to this slide, and we move on to the indirect emissions. While the installation has determined how much electricity is consumed in megawatt hour, then there is a factor, emission factor taken from this IEA data. In this case, it's a country hypothetical example where the electricity mix in the grid is based a lot on coal, so it's a relatively high emission factor. That is multiplied with the electricity consumption, and one gets the indirect emissions of 67,953 tons. The third number needed now is how much clinker is produced. So it's 1.255 million per year. And the next, so now we are only for the clinker already at step 5 of the calculation. We just take the total direct emissions, the total indirect emissions, and divide it by how much clinker is produced. And that gives the specific embedded emissions of the clinker, and that's the final result for the clinker. So that was the production process 1. Now we move to the production process 2. How do we now calculate the specific embedded emissions of the cement? Well, as input, we need first, because clinker is used for, so that's the simple good, and we're not talking about complex good, so we need the input value, the specific embedded emissions of the clinker, taken over as the result from the previous slide. So that's the first row here. Then we need to know how much clinker is used to produce cement. The assumption here is, well, we need 95% clinker, very typical for Portland cement, and maybe the rest is other mineral compounds. And then for the calculation, we also need to take account emissions that happen at the cement production. As I already said, the assumption here in this example is there's no direct emissions, but there's some electricity consumed. Well, you have to mix the clinker with other materials. Maybe there's some grinding ongoing. So there is an electricity consumption. And again, 0.85 megawatt hour you need per ton of cement produced. And that is again multiplied with an emission factor for electricity. And that gives you then the indirect emissions. So now the final calculation step is to calculate the specific embedded emissions of the cement. We need to take the specific emissions of the clinker as a precursor, basically multiply it with the 95%. That gives us a value for direct of 0.7852 and for indirect of 0.0514. Then in the cement production process as such, we do not have any more direct emissions. So that's already the final value. And for indirect emissions, we need to add the contribution of the electricity in that case. So summing up the two numbers on the right side gives then the final specific embedded emissions for direct and indirect. Okay, so this is a worked example. You can find that example also in the guidance with the same numbers, and we invite you to look at it. I think it helps a lot in understanding how the whole thing works. You can take your calculator and try to mirror and replicate the calculations. That's it for the methodology.
Thank you very much, Thomas. I can see in the chat that there's already coming in a lot of specific questions to this presentation. Now I would like to start with the third part of this webinar. It will introduce the concept of the reporting obligations during the transitional period. And Maxime, the floor is yours again.
Thank you, Camilla. Now let's have a look at the roles of different actors, and we can also start with the operators of installation, and more in general on this slide, showing you a general overview of how the CBAM will function, and with the roles of the different parties involved in the CBAM. We will not go through details for each of the actors playing the CBAM field, but as you can see, I think that the most important element to stress is that this slide shows that CBAM will be a mechanism whose implementation will require a regular dialogue and a communication between the various sectors. Of course, starting from the operators of installation located in non-EU countries, with all the steps that Thomas explained in putting together the relevant data on goods imported into the EU. Let's take a few examples of the very important and regular communication between actors. Of course, the communication between the operators and the reporting declarants will be key for an obvious reasons that you all guess, which is the collection of the relevant data to be reported to comply with the CBAM obligations, reporting obligations. There will be also very important exchange between the customs authorities, which are authorities at national level, so member states national custom authorities. For instance, with the reporting declarants in the transitional phase, the custom authorities will be there to inform the importers of their obligation to report information on the goods that they import into the EU. Another important flow of information will take place between the Commission and the national competent authorities appointed by member states, and we can see that there are some questions about this. They are in the process of being appointed by member states, and the European Commission and the national competent authorities will dialogue, for instance, in the performance of the review and the assessment of the implementation of the CBAM. Another important flow of information will take place between the national competent authorities, so at EU member states level, and the reporting declarants. That is very important, and this communication will take place in the CBAM transitional registry that we will discuss a bit later. Thank you. Now looking at the importers. This slide is about explaining the difference between reporting declarants and importers. The CBAM applies on goods, but who bears the liability? During the transitional period, the reporting declarant is responsible and therefore has to comply with the reporting obligation. And the reporting declarant is the one submitting the quarterly CBAM reports of embedded emissions in the good that they import into the EU on that quarter. There are different situations. First, is the importer based in the EU or not? If the importer is based in the EU, then there is a choice to make for the importer to make. Either the importer chooses to be the reporting declarant for CBAM purposes, or the importer can appoint a customs representative. Again, still in the same example, the importer is based in the EU. Then the importer will be the person liable to comply to the CBAM related obligations, unless the importer chooses an indirect customs representative, if the latter so agrees. In any case, the reporting declarant never is the direct customs representative. If the importer is not based in the EU, then there is no choice to make. The importer must appoint an indirect customs representative as reporting declarant. And this indirect customs representative will bear the responsibility to comply with the reporting obligations. Finally, please note that there is no specific authorization procedure for national competent authorities to grant any status during the transitional period. This specific authorization procedure will start as from 2026 to authorize to grant the status of authorized CBAM declarant. And this procedure will be introduced in 2025 ahead of the start of the definitive period. So this slide is about, I think, a very relevant question that some of you who are importers ask yourself. What should I do to comply with the CBAM reporting rules? The first question, which is step one, is understanding how you, as an importer, you are impacted by the CBAM. So the first question is to determine how the scope of the CBAM that we discussed matches the goods that you import into the EU, and how also that match with the aggregated goods category that Thomas explained. And to answer this question, you must compare as an importer, you must compare the CN codes of the goods that you import into the EU against the list of goods which are covered by the CBAM regulation, and you have to look at Annex 1 of the CBAM regulation from May 2023. As a second step, if you are an importer importing CBAM goods into the EU, as a second step, you need to align with the reporting period that is used by the operator of installation that produces the goods you import. By default, the calendar period is suggested, but the installation producing the goods, which is located in a different country, may have a different calendar, or there might be some reasonable arguments for choosing a different period. And this is possible, provided that that alternative reporting period covers at least 3 months. As a third step, you must be aware of the type of information that you are to declare regarding the CBAM goods that you import. And this is very important, and this information you must request it from the operators of installation or operators of installations, if there are several installations producing the goods that you import, so that you are able to report this information. As Thomas explained earlier in the presentation, there are some choices to make regarding the different approaches to calculate the embedded emissions. What are the direct emissions? Which methodology has been used to monitor the emissions? What are the indirect emissions? Are there precursors? Are there, if yes, precursors, are they produced in the same installation, etc.? There are a lot of parameters to determine. And as an importer, you are responsible to collecting that data on embedded emissions on the goods that you import into the EU and request that data from the operators of installations. And we see in the chat that there are some questions about this step. Finally, as a fourth step, as an importer, you will report information on the carbon price that has been paid in the country where the installation producing the goods that you import is located, if there is such a carbon price, of course. This step is very important, even during the transitional period, even though there is still not a financial adjustment. Like we said, it will only enter into force in 2026, but it is very important for us to understand what are the different carbon pricing schemes that exist in the world, so that we make sure that the financial adjustment as from the definitive period will be able to take that into account. As you may acknowledge, all these steps require a regular cooperation and a communication between operators of installations and the importers. And monitoring and reporting can only be successful if there is this cooperation and this regular dialogue between the two parties. That's why it's very relevant, and we developed 2 tools to help you in that communication. First, we have a framework which summarizes the information to be reported. You will find this framework in Annex 4 of the 17 August 2023 implementing regulation. It is called recommended communication from operators of installation to reporting requirements. And the second tool that we have developed is a communication template, which serves as a basis for importers to gather data from operators of installation. And this communication template was made available on the CBAM dedicated webpage that Elena referred to in her welcome speech. They are on the European Commission website. Obviously, these 2 tools are not mandatory for you to use, but they are here to help you. And we can only encourage you to make the best use of these tools. For instance, there may be a lot of cases where importers import goods into the EU from several producers located in different countries with different languages. Or second example, producers of CBAM goods, so located in non-EU countries, but they export goods into the EU via several importers. And having a single data collection process with that communication template will be key, I think, for you to use to really make your life easier. In the last section, we will provide you with a very brief snapshot of the transitional registry and some basic information on the timelines. Starting with the main page of the CBAM Transitional Registry, we can see that there are some questions about this transitional registry. It is in the making and will be very soon up and running, so that the transitional period can start at 1st of October. And once they are logged in, the reporting declarants will see that main page. On this page, you will find all the information that you make use of to report information and submit your CBAM reports. So we can navigate very briefly with the various steps. In the first box will be my quarterly reports. And in that page, in that section of the transitional registry, reporting declarants will access information about all the past quarterly reports and the existing quarterly reports. They will be able to edit the reports and to make changes and to seek information from different parts of the transitional registry to create synergy and to be time efficient. Then in the next box, in installations, reporting declarants will find information about all the installations that are linked to the reporting declarants account, so there will be installation of the goods, producing the goods that importers import to the EU. In the next slide, this is the box on operators will be where reporting declarants will find information on the operators of the said installations. In my importers, the next one, reporting declarants will find information on all the importers that are linked to the reporting declarants account. And the final one, my profile information, this is where reporting declarants will record their own information. It is very important to stress that this single platform has been designed in a way to allow the reporting declarants to seek and gather all the information that they need to comply with the reporting obligations using this specific tool. And this tool, the transitional registry, will be accessible also by the national competent authorities of the member states and the Commission services, so that all the communication can take place within the same platform. Now, moving to the timelines. So as we said earlier, during the transitional period, the CBAM reports will have to be submitted for every quarter. This time frame will be different during the transition, the definitive phase, because the declarations will take place on an annual basis. But focusing on the transitional period, as you can see on the screen, there are one point important to comment is the flexibility that we introduced for the first two CBAM reports. As you can see, the first two CBAM reports, so namely which are due for the 21st of January 2024 and the 30th of April, the modification, the correction of the reports will be possible until the 31st of July. And this flexibility has been introduced to allow the reporting declarants and the operators of installation sufficient time to make the necessary changes. As from that period, the reporting declarants will be given the possibility to correct their CBAM reports up to 2 months after the end of the reporting period. And that's it on my side. Back to you, Camilla.
Thank you very much, Maxime. I think for now, there has been a lot of questions raised in the chat already. We will take a 2 minutes break and then resume after that to answer the questions. And we are back again. Due to the technical difficulties we had in the beginning of this webinar, I think we would like to extend the Q&A with 10 to 15 minutes. I hope that's okay with all of the participants. As said, there are quite a lot of questions that are raised, so for us to be able to address them accordingly, we will need to extend the time a bit. I will address some of the general issues that are questions that have been raised in the chat, and that's, for example, how to access the CBAM Transitional Registry. The CBAM Transitional Registry is the registry where all the reporting obligations are, and of course, that's an important tool for this transitional period. However, the design and the registry is still being built, but you will get access to the registry as soon as possible. As said by my colleague, it is either the importer or the indirect customs representative that's responsible and liable for the reporting obligations during the transitional period. This means that they will need to contact the competent authority in their member state of establishment to gain access to the registry. The access to the registry will be based on their current ORI number, so you will need to have that, and that is of course something that you will need to address using the traditional customs systems. A few of you has addressed how the reporting system will look like. There will be dedicated training as well to how to report, but already now you can see in the implementing regulation, if you look at Annex 1, already there you can see the information that we will require from you during the transitional period. So if you're interested in needing to see what information will be there, look please into Annex 1. It will explain quite a bit for you. There are also questions on the territory. As stated, this is a measure that's applicable to the EU. This means that it's goods that imported into the customs union. There are specific questions also to the territory. For example, what happens when goods originate from the EEA countries? And there you will need to know that CBAM is exempted because they're already a part of the EU ETS, so their emissions are already accounted for. Yeah, I think actually that's the general questions that are raised for now. So I will, if my colleague Thomas is ready to address some of the issues on the methodology.
Okay, yes. Oops. Okay, there are a lot of questions. I hope I get most of them. Let's start there. I have seen a number of questions on default values. First, just to clarify, there are different types of default values. Actually, there are three. First are the default values for the CBAM goods other than electricity, direct, and that can be direct emissions or for indirect emissions. Then second, we have default values for electricity as a CBAM good, and there will be default values for to calculate indirect emissions for the electricity that is used for that. Okay, on probably the most relevant here for the cement sector, the default values for the direct and indirect emissions of the different cement goods. We will publish them soon, hopefully next week, but in any case before the end of the month. These values then will be available also in the CBAM registry, and they can be used as explained without any limitation for the reporting until middle of next year. So the first 3 quarters the reporting can rely entirely on default values. After that, these default values can only be used if they represent less than 20% of the overall embedded emissions of the good. So for 80% of the embedded emissions, a better methodology, and ideally the one that is spelled out in the implementing regulations, is reused, and only for 20% you can use the default values. There was a question I've seen on verification. Again, to clarify, during the transitional period, there is no need to verify the reported data. This is something that will come in the definitive CBAM period starting in 2026. And there's also quite some implementing legislation still to be adopted about how this verification will work. There was a question on what is relevant for deciding if a good is under the CBAM or not, if it needs to be both under the CN code and be used in the sector. So the answer is, what is relevant is the CN code. We are well aware that, for example, in the fertilizer sectors, you have some basic chemicals, and while they're often used or mostly used to produce fertilizers, sometimes they're also used for other things. What counts is the CN code. So if a good falls under CN code, then it's under CBAM. There was a question: who is responsible for carrying out, for applying the methodology and for the determination of the embedded emissions? First, it is the responsibility of the operator of the responsibility of the importer to ensure that correct values are submitted. So the obligation is on the importer, and because this is the one who also needs to be based in the EU or its representative. However, of course, the calculation of the determination can only be done by the operator. So it's for the importer to ensure that the operator determines the embedded emissions correctly. And then there was a question on the reference period, I think, or 2 or 3, asking what is the relevant reference period. So ideally, the reference period should be the one for which the emissions are reported. So it's, if the data is available for the 3 months, that will be the allocation. But we are aware that this is maybe complicated because under some, for example, some emission monitoring schemes, maybe the reporting is only based on yearly data. So then I think that's also acceptable. But that's maybe something I would have to check again in detail. Colleagues, did I miss something important? Question? Yes, go back. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, I will summarize a few other questions, a few other general questions, and then we can go a bit back and forth. There has been a question to the list of competent authorities in the member states. The Commission worked hard, and I know that the member states work hard as well. We have had a very limited time now to introduce the implementing regulation. And I know the member states are still adapting. So as soon as they have appointed all their competent authorities, that list will be made publicly available. There are also questions in regard to where you can continue to find information, also specific information and answers to your question. The Commission, we will continue to update our website on CBAM, where general questions and specific questions, detailed questions will be answered in the dedicated Q&A on that webpage. So please go in and check, maybe make a suggestion to check it every Monday morning to see what's new on the webpage. There's also a question on the reporting language. As said, the Commission, we work hard, so we would always prefer to have the reporting in English as it makes our job easier. So that's it from my side, and I think I can give the floor to Maxime.
Yeah, maybe as a first general comment that may address at least parts of the question that we received. I think it's very important to stress again that the transitional registry will be the tool that importers will use in submitting the CBAM reports. They will be able to upload the data and documents like in PDF, Word, etc. They will be able to retrieve the data that has been recorded in different parts of the transitional registry. For instance, the list of installations, They will use this tool, this platform, single platform, to communicate with the national competent authorities of the member states. So this is where everything for importers will take place, from the uploading of the information, saving, editing, and later exchanging with the various authorities. I think it's very important to stress that once again, and it will be accessible very soon, so that it is up and running for the start of the transitional period. Then there were some questions, several questions about the information collection process between operators and importers. It is a very relevant question. The liabilities, as we explained, will lie on the importers, which will be the reporting declarants, unless they have an indirect customs representative. So the reporting obligations will be on them. However, as you know, most of the information will be put together by the operators of installation. And that's why we stressed a lot during the presentation that the implementation of the CBAM and the reporting requirements of the CBAM will require in practice regular dialogue and communication between the two parties. It's very essential for the importers to comply with the reporting obligations. If there is a problem, and that may happen, then there is different choices. There can be, the importer can use the default values that we will publish, but the default values cannot be used for all the goods, all the embedded emissions in the goods that we import into the EU. There's a cap. So there will be some dialogue between the importers and the operators, which is very important, especially during the transitional phase. And again, penalties may be imposed on importers. They are meant as a last resort when there is a failure to comply with the reporting obligation. That's why we really encourage all the parties to cooperate in providing the data. Then there was also some general questions about the information that we have provided during this webinar. Please note again that this webinar will be made publicly accessible on the dedicated webpage, so you will be able to see it again as many times as you want and have access to the information which is in it. We will update, like Camilla said, a lot of information on the website so that we can take stock of the various webinars that we are having to improve these resources available to you. Then there were also some questions on the roles of customs. During the transitional phase, the customs will be in charge of this dialogue between the member states authorities and the reporting declarants. It can be, for instance, making sure that all the importers are aware of their reporting obligations and have to register as reporting declarants and then submit their CBAM reports. So that can be, in practice, a dialogue taking place on the field. The customs authorities have this information about the importers, and in the regular mission and exercise of duties, they are the best place to do that. They will not review the CBAM reports themselves. As we presented on the general overview slide, the effective implementation of the CBAM will be performed first by the Commission services, which will then contact the member states' national competent authorities if there is such a need. But the customs will not perform this check on the field. There are some questions about the penalties. The penalties, there are some there is a frame in the implementing regulation about the penalties which will apply on importers who fail to comply with the reporting obligations. So you can see that in the implementing regulation. And I think that's it on my side.
Yep.
Thomas.
Thomas, do you have additional questions you want to address? Yeah.
Yes. First, coming back to this question on the reference period for reporting. I invite you to have a look at Annex 3, Section A of the implementing regulation, where actually it is said that the default reporting period is a calendar year. So if you are reporting specific, what needs to report is every year, but every quarter the amounts of goods imported. But the calculation of the specific amount of emissions could be done on a yearly basis. There are alternatives. If there's more short-term data available, that's possible. There was questions if cement is a complex good, or more generally, how do we know if a good is a simple good or a complex good? Please have a look at the implementing regulation. For each of the aggregated goods categories, it is specified if under that goods category there are relevant precursors or not. If there are no relevant precursors, then it's clear it's a simple good. A question was there on what needs to be reported, absolute emissions or relative emissions. Well, I think what needs to be reported in the IT system is the relative, so it's a specific embedded emissions, but at the same time, also the amount of goods imported are reported. So that means then automatically the absolute emissions can be calculated from that. There was a question on if there are at one site, there are two different plants and with different greenhouse gas efficiency, should they be treated as one or two installations? That is my preliminary answer. I would say, yes, if it is possible to separate the determination of the specific embedded emissions between the two plants, I would say yes, that would be a possibility. However, if the technical connections are so close that is not possible, then probably these two plants should be treated as one installation. And that's, I think, the questions I've seen. Yeah.
Okay. I see that there's one question also raised on the obligation and the status of a reporting declarant. I think I want to repeat what my colleague Maxime explained in his slide 28. And that is, in the transitional period, there's no need to apply for an authorization. Your status as a reporting declarant will be accounted for from 1st of October this year until the end of the transitional period. Of course, that's in the end of 25. However, for the definitive phase of authorized CBAM declarant, that implementing act, we are working on that already now for the authorization module. That's where you need to apply to become an authorized CBAM declarant. And we hope that that implementing act will be adopted next year, of course, for it to be able to enter into force from 1st of January 25. This means that from 1st of January 25, you can apply in your member state of establishment for the grant of becoming an authorized CBAM declarant. So that's the difference between the transitional period and the definitive period. However, the persons behind the status of a reporting declarant and authorized declarant is the same. Maxime, I think you had some additional questions you wanted to raise.
There has been different questions, several questions on two aspects. First, on the access to the transitional registry. The information that will be available on this transitional registry will be secured, which means that nothing will be made publicly available to anyone. Which means that as a reporting declarant, when navigating in the various functionalities of this transitional registry, you will have access to the information that is relevant for you to use in the CBAM reports. But only the person only a very limited number of persons have access to this information. The reporting declarants, the person who recorded this information. For instance, if you navigate in the list of installations or operators of installation, there will be some information that you as a reporting declarant has not necessarily uploaded yourself. There will be some information also accessible from the national competent authorities and the European Commissions. But in no cases the information held in this registry will be made accessible to the public. I think it's very, very important to stress that point. Security. Then there was also a bulk of questions about the verification. So maybe as a start, verification will only be mandatory as from 2026. And the specific rules applying to the verification processes and how the verifiers will be accredited to perform their duty, for instance, which is one of the key parameters in the questions that we have seen. They will be laid down in an act that we will adopt by the end of the transitional period. But today it is too premature to share some more information on that. And I think that it covers the point on the verification as well. I think it's okay.
Yeah.
A few more questions I've seen. Okay.
I think we have 2 questions left that we want to address.
Yes, well, I'm not sure if it's all questions are left. There was a question on which are the relevant input materials for cement. That's a bit similar to the question on simple and complex good. Yeah, please have a look at the description of the aggregated goods categories and where it is specified which materials should be monitored, and from then it's clear should be clear for under each of the goods categories which are relevant input materials. And then there was a question on the use of other default values. So when speaking about determining the indirect emissions, so the general option here for the reporting should be that data published by the Commission based on the International Energy Agency are used. These are the default values that we will provide in the system. However, there's also the possibility to use any other emission factor of the country of origin, but these data should then be publicly available, and they should represent either the average emission factor or the CO2 emission factor, which has a very specific meaning. So under certain conditions, other default values could also be used.
I saw that there were also 2 questions on the customs representation. So just to stress again, the rules in that respect. If you are an importer located outside of the EU, then there is no other choice for you to make than to appoint an indirect custom representative to comply with the CBAM related obligations. If you are an importer based in the EU, which was not the question, but I'm still giving you some more information, then you have the choices that we explained a bit earlier to make, and you can refer to the slide. But if you are located outside of the EU, then there is no other choice for you to make than appointing an indirect custom representative who will bear the CBAM related reporting obligations.
I think and I hope that we have addressed the questions that you have raised in the chat. I think me and the team would like to thank you for your patience and participation in this webinar, and I hope it has been useful for you to participate. Right after the end of this webinar, you will receive a feedback survey from us. We would really appreciate your comments on what was good and what can be improved for us to address it in the webinars to come. And you will also receive after this webinar the supporting material that we have used for you to help you guide you through the transitional period. So again, thank you for joining this event, and we might see you in another. Have a nice day.